Mein Hals beit, vergess mich nicht. In Leiden, in Frieden, vergess mich nicht. Weil ich bleib ewig dein, gedenk, das geht wie die Versailles. Vergess mich nicht. Where you go, please forget me not. Through joy and sorrow, forget me not. Because your words, they mean such a lot. There where you go, forget me not. Dir wegnimmst du meine Scham mit dir. Dein Namen bleibe, die Becke du in Haus bei mir. Drei kleine Wörter, Gedenkse geht doch weit bei dir. Vergess mich nicht. Where you go, my heart goes away with you. Your name and mine are bound together, yes, it's true. Three little words, they mean such a lot. There where you go, forget me not.
Hello and welcome to the Town Hall. This is Melay Araya dialing in. I am the artistic director of the Town Hall and the host for this evening. That was Forget Me Not, featuring two of our guests this evening, Eleanor Reissa and Frank London at 54 Below. Forget Me Not was composed by Jacob Jacobs and Abraham Elstein and was translated by Eleanor Reissa. Today is but one installment in a series entitled Century of Story and Song. The Town Hall was founded in 1921 by a group of suffragists who wanted the space to be a home for adult education, consciousness raising, and civil discussion. But we are also known for our great performance history, including Isaac Stern, Paul Robeson, Louis Armstrong, Bob Dylan, Billie Holiday, Leontine Price, Nina Simone, Philip Glass, Kronos, and more. Yiddish songs were performed at the Town Hall as early as the first decade in the 1920s. So was Yiddish poetry. But Yiddish theater became popular in the post-war Town Hall history. Here to speak with us this evening about the history of Yiddish theater in New York, and specifically the history of Yiddish theater at the Town Hall, we have Frank London, Eleanor Reissa, and Nahma Sandrow. Frank London is a Grammy Award-winning trumpeter, composer, and co-founder of the Klezmatics. His compositions include Freilich, klezmer fantasy for trumpet and orchestra, the Yiddish-Cuban opera Hatui, Memory of Fire with Elise Thorin, Salome, Woman of Valor with Adina Karasik, and 1001 Voices, Symphony for a New America with Judith Sloan and Warren Lehrer. Frank has worked with John Zorn, Karen O, Itzhak Perlman, Pink Floyd, LL Cool J, Mel Torme, Lester Bowie, Lamont Young, They Might Be Giants, David Byrne, Jane Siberry, Ben Folds 5, and is on over 500 CDs and was featured on Sex and the City. Eleanor Reissa is an early hyphenate in Yiddish and English. Her career highlights include being a Tony-nominated director for Those Were the Days, a Broadway actor in Decent, a playwright, The Last Survivor, a television actor, HBO's The Plot Against America, and is a singing partner with Frank London and the Klezmer Brass All-Stars in New York City and around the world. Now, Nahma Sandrow, who I pronounced her name correctly first time around, is the author of Vagabond Stars, A World History of Yiddish Theater, and the translator of many Yiddish plays. She wrote the libretto for several award-winning off-Broadway musicals, and for Enemies, a love story, an opera based on the I.B. Singer novel. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us this evening. Did we lose Frank?
He must be making his applesauce.
I think so. Frank, you back? All right. Thank you all for being here.
Good to be here.
Hi. Yeah.
Great.
Hi.
Wonderful. Well, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask all of you, starting with Frank and going to Eleanor and then to Nahma, about your relationship to Yiddish theater, and particularly Yiddish theater in New York at Town Hall, the like.
Okay. Of the three of us, I did not grow up with Yiddish language or music or theater. Grew up in suburban Long Island, just listening to rock and roll, and I came to klezmer music, which is the music of the same Ashkenazi Jews who speak Yiddish. But I love theater. I love avant-garde theater, especially. And I started discovering Yiddish theater, and it's got such a great tradition. In its time, they say that Wael Peretz's A Night in the Old Marketplace, which I did an adaptation of, actually presaged Seven Characters in Search of an Author as the first sort of radical theater piece that subverted audience and character and play. So Yiddish theater, I love the history of it. And I think one of the first pieces I ever did in New York was with Eleanor Reissa. It was called Zisa Chaloimus. I'm sure she'll tell you more about that. And as Melay mentioned, I just recently composed and premiered the first Yiddish opera. It's a Yiddish-Cuban opera about an indigenous Taino chief named Hatwe and his struggle. He led the first armed uprising against the Spanish colonialists and was martyred. So I just love every aspect of Yiddish theater. Vis-a-vis Town Hall, I've had the pleasure of playing on the Town Hall stage many times. The Klezmatics played and filmed our 20th anniversary concert there. We did our Havana Nagila Cuban Yiddish fusion music at Town Hall. I've played on Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion many times. And I was invited by Malay's predecessor, Papa, to create a show especially for Town Hall called From Moses to Mastel, a history of the Jews as told through Yiddish theater. And in that we used Yiddish songs from all sorts of musical theater pieces that tell the whole history of the Jews. Eleanor directed it. Robert Klein was the guest narrator. And I just love every time I do anything on Town Hall stage, and especially anything Jewish, because I feel connected to this 100 years of Jewish history and Town Hall, whether it's the fact that Emma Goldman gave her first speech once she came back from the Soviet Union on Town Hall, or Theodore Bickel recording his live concerts there. There's so much history there and so much living life. So, okay, that's me.
We actually should at some point do a history of Jewish literature and theology and philosophy at the Town Hall, because there's this whole Abraham Heschel thing going on as well. But that'll be another event, which I'll probably have some of you back for. So, Eleanor, would you mind taking it from there?
I spent a lot of time at Town Hall in my early days. Yiddish was my first language. my parents came to America in 1949. But I learned English in school, and then it surpassed Yiddish, and Yiddish for me became a secondary poor language, really. I spoke Yinglish more than Yiddish at that time, as growing up, kind of. But I was interested in the theater, and so in English. And I started doing political theater, street theater. It was a political time when I went to Brooklyn College. And it was also a very big off-Broadway time of the open theater and Grotowski and physical theater. And in 1976, I got my first Actors Equity job, a contract on the national tour of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And I was working towards getting work in English. But then in 1978 or 79, there was an ad in Backstage that this theater called Town Hall was looking for chorus people. And I kind of sang. I didn't really know at that time that I sang. I was the kind of artist who, if you said, "Can you do this?" I would say yes. And then I would try to do it to different degrees of success. But anyway, so that was at Town Hall. It was a show called Rebecca the Rabbi's Daughter, in Yiddish, Rivka Ledem Rebens. And lo and behold, I got the job in the chorus, the smallest role in the play. And that was the beginning of 5 years or so of working at Town Hall. So, Melay, what should I stop there? Kind of.
We'll get more to you.
Yeah.
When we get to sort of that stage of Yiddish theater in New York. But Nahma, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your work in Yiddish theater, both as a scholar and a librettist and a translator, and then take us a little bit through the beginnings of Yiddish theater in New York, which in some ways overlap a lot with Town Hall's history, even though we're founded in 1921. A lot of the end of the 19th century New York politics is what really, and immigration is what really sets the stage for our founding. So a lot in common there.
Right. Well, I lived when I was little for a while. We lived with my grandparents, and Yiddish was their language. And so, although I never really spoke a grown-up Yiddish, I was attached to it. I loved the sound of it. It wasn't until I was in my late teens that my grandmother and I went to the Yiddish Theater. We went to see a show, a play that was based on the same group of stories by Shalom Aleichem that Fiddler on the Roof is based on. Only it was very different from Fiddler on the Roof. It was sad. It was sad. And we sat next to each other. My grandmother and I were both easy criers, and we had my grandfather's big man's cotton handkerchief, and we passed it back and forth, and we sobbed. It was sodden, and we cried, and it was wonderful. And compared to that, I went to the theater a lot. I loved the theater. But what I was used to seeing on Broadway and even off Broadway was namby-pamby little, they had ideas, or else they had a little drama. This was large, and it was dark, and it was old. I loved it. I loved it. And after that, I went whenever I could. And a few years later, I wrote a book about French Surrealist theater, which is pretty different. And then I started writing about Yiddish theater, which is so lucky. I was so lucky because a few years later, and I'd have missed, I saw that generation. I saw wonderful performances. I I met, among other people, I got to meet the guy that wrote "Vergess mich nicht," that Eleanor just sang. He wrote the lyrics. I had a wonderful time at Yiddish Theater, and then I wrote a book about it. So I guess yes, I will give you a kind of background so that we understand what Town Hall was, what it came out of. And I think there will be images that will illustrate what I'm talking about. You're going to see a picture of a young couple. They look like kids. And that's Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski, who are the first stars. There they are. They were the first stars, and he, in fact, was one of the first of the matinee idols. It's hard to believe when you see it there. Matinee idols of Yiddish theater. Women swooned in the aisles for him. And Yiddish theater itself was young. Yiddish theater began in this country 1881, which was only the fifth year that it existed anywhere. The first professional performance had been only 5 years before in Romania. And it was exactly the beginning of the mass migration of Yiddish-speaking Jews to the United States. And it worked out that many people, very many people, most at that period, saw their first performances of Yiddish theater not in Eastern Europe where it began and where the mass of Yiddish speakers was, but in the United States. And most likely, although not necessarily, in New York City. Immediately, Yiddish theater was popular all over the world, Australia and Uganda and Latin America and later Tashkent, all over. People loved it. But here, first of all, it was reliably legal. And there are a lot of memoirs in which people remember they had money for either supper or a theater ticket. And they picked the theater ticket. But here, at least, they had money for one of them, whereas in the old country, maybe not. So New York City became the heart of it. And it turned out that the culture immediately had this appetite for theater. There's an expression, they ate their bread smeared with theater. They loved theater. And they loved their stars. And there was a very lively Yiddish press at that time, and they had to write a lot about theater, reviews and interviews. There were amateur Yiddish theaters all over the world, wherever Jews ended up. There were amateur theaters, and therefore there were a lot of plays published so that people could perform them. There were musical comedies, and there were domestic dramas, and there were melodramas, this old-fashioned stuff, and there was avant-garde, intellectual, cerebral plays, and of course it was never in isolation. So there were also translations of classics, Western classics, other languages, and there were translations of the latest hits, and audiences went back and forth. Yiddish speakers went to non-Yiddish theater, and non-Yiddish speakers came to. There were a lot. Yiddish plays were often reviewed in the New York papers in English, and Yiddish actors who already had their union in New York helped Actors Equity organize. They brought coffee and donuts to the picket line.
What is the name of the union? What was the name of the union?
Hebrew Actors Union.
Hebrew Actors Union.
The Hebrew Actor, because Hebrew sounded classier than Yiddish. Yiddish was the people's language, so they called it Hebrew.
It was the first professional acting union in the country, was the Hebrew Actors Union.
Yeah, and it existed until recently when it was absorbed into Equity.
Wow.
Yeah, there was an Italian Actors Union here and a Chinese, but it was the first. Also a chorus union. Also, I think an ushers union. I might be making that up. I don't know. But by 1921, there were, which is our big year because that's when Town Hall opened. Right? So there were 14, most years, there were 14 legitimate Yiddish theaters in New York, and there were music halls, and there were cabaret shows, and there were tours going out of New York, and there were tours coming into New York. And of course, it was it was an immigrant language originally, and the generation by 1921, there were a lot of people assimilating out, or they preferred not to. Their parents knew Yiddish, their grandparents knew Yiddish. It's the American way, they were assimilating out. But there were always, the old country sent more and more to replenish. 1921, there were laws passed restricting immigration into the United States. So the faucet, it wasn't turned totally off, but immigration was restricted a lot. And so it didn't show right away, but it began to show that there were fewer Yiddish speakers. And then came Hitler, and then came Stalin. And they wiped out the artists and the audiences in the old country. But that left the United States and other places around the globe, but especially the United States. Here is where it still flourished. That was the main creative center. And it remains so. And Town Hall was one of the places where it performed. And it became part of history, and it's where I got to see Eleanor's debut. I saw her Yiddish Theater debut, and it was a great show, and she was wonderful. She was so charming on the stage. She really was. So Town Hall is part of this history, and
I'm excited to get more into
there we
that.
are.
But Nahma, I actually wanted to go back and have all of you speak about some of these major figures in your own memory or your own engagement with these major figures in Yiddish theater. Like, for example, you spoke about the Tomaszewskis, but, David Kessler, for example.
Well, David Kessler, he's the one all the way on the left, on my left anyway, not at the white jacket is Adler, and the left and the brown jacket facing him is Kessler, and he was famous for having a feeling for Stanislavskian subtlety. And Adler on the other side, Adler, it doesn't show how glamorous he was. Adler's another one. Girls, he was, there's so many stories. Oh, you can't tell from that. There's so many stories about how he walked down the street in a cloak, and the girls looked at him and stared at him, and his dressing room was all fitted up with little silken cushions and little lamps with rosy shades, and he had a lot of children that went into Yiddish theater. That's true too.
Nahma,
Yeah.
was he related to Stella Adler? No relation.
Yeah.
Was
He was
he?
her father.
Really?
Her father?
Oh,
Oh,
Yeah.
I kind of
And
felt
Celia Adler's father, and Luther Adler's father, and Celia by one wife, and the other guys by another wife.
For those who don't know, Stella Adler is known best, I guess, as a teacher, right? As the preeminent acting.
Well, in the
teacher.
group theater.
Yeah.
She was in the group theater. She was in serious theaters of the 30s.
I had never made that connection.
Yeah. Well, I know it's off topic, but I'm actually enjoying the off topic. You said, Nahma, your first book was about French surrealistic theater, and Eleanor's talking about political activism. I think these worlds between Yiddish theater and the performers in it and other theaters, I mean, it was fluid. And I think about Zero Mostel acting in Rhinoceros, for example. as because even though they're very different worlds, there is, I don't know, something about Yiddish theater relates to me to different forms of both surrealistic theater, of agitprop theater, of political theater. But we go. I'm taking us off
Well,
topic.
there's room. Yiddish theater did it. Yiddish theater did everything. That's
Yeah.
why I have another book. It's my third book of translations, and it's coming out this winter. And this one has got a symbolist scene, an expressionist scene, and to give some sampling, because these were people who loved theater, so they of course they were aware they were not in a ghetto intellectually.
But you
They
said
tried
that
everything.
Kessler was more the Stanislavski.
Yeah, supposed to be. Supposed to be. And the third was Tomaszewski, who's also in that scene. You wouldn't recognize him from the kid in the first scene, but he's in that scene as well.
I mean,
You know,
Nahma,
it's a different.
the competition between those men.
Yeah.
Can you speak about that a little bit? It was intense,
I
wasn't it?
think it's true. You know, it all sounds like showbiz stories, but I think it's true that
I mean,
they
one
were
opened,
rivals.
one opened a show, and the other opened a competing show, and
So right,
the
right.
same show.
Well, there are one of them says in his memoirs, Adler had an army on stage, and I had an army and a horse on stage, and not the first theater to have a horse on stage, by the way. Or let's see, supposed to be that Adler was losing for a while. People were going more to other shows, to rivals of his, and he gave out word that he was dying. And he got himself to the window of the hospital, and meanwhile, people had collected. People had walked across the Brooklyn Bridge to stand under the window of the hospital because he was going to bid farewell. And they walked, many of them, because it was Shabbos. It was Saturday. They wouldn't ride, but they had to come and see Adler. And Adler hauled himself to the window, and he gave a very affecting farewell speech, a long speech. People were in tears. And then he turned around and he said to the people, and it was matinee day. I left that out. It was matinee day. It was afternoon. It was matinee time. And he turned around and he said, even on matinee day, even on a deathbed, Adler can empty all the theaters on 2nd Avenue. Oh, yeah. There was a lot of competition between, and the women as well.
Isn't there
the stars as well.
But
people loved them. They carried them on chairs. They adored them. They fought duels for them.
And when
not
they
duels, but
when they died, the streets were filled.
Yeah, that's true. That's really true. That's in the New York Times, which is not 100%, but it's probably true. Many thousands of
thousands of people
follow them through the streets to their cemeteries. In Brooklyn, most of them are buried. That's Nellie
Kassman.
Oh, there we go.
Yeah, that's Frank's. I saw her just once, and she was an old lady, and a dirty old lady. She was on the stage. She sang a song about. The chorus was, "You men in the audience, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking I'm too old, but when you turn the lights out, yeah, when you turn the lights out, I'm just as good as any young chippy." And then one of her particular shticks, and that's a New York theater word, but it's Yiddish. One of her shticks was and I got to see her. She shimmied. That means I can't do it well enough, but from here down to maybe the hips, she shook like a jelly, and she had a hat with a flower sticking up, and the flower was shaking too. Everything was shaking, and she looked down at herself, and she she was so pleased with herself. Everybody adored her, including me. It was adorable, that childlike and also so naughty.
I mean, she wrote the hit song "Yussel Yussel." Wasn't
Was
didn't she
Oh,
do that?
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, she was one of the
Yeah.
earliest women who were like composer, not just the chanteuse or the bawdy singer or whatever, but who was also the composer. And I guess we'll talk about it more later, but we're calling, I think, this whole show the Showgirl, based on a show that she wrote the music for back in the 20s that was revived in Town Hall in the 80s. But we'll talk more about that. But yeah, Nellie Kasman, she, like you say, wrote beautiful, dirty, jazzy songs of the moment and had a beautiful, long life. So she was actually there coaching people um, for the revival. I don't know if she was coaching, I just made that up. But she was there for the revival. It was the very end of her life. And
That's how I got to see her.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a question I have is about Yiddish theater generally is what percentage of the plays that went up were musicals or were plays that had music in them?
Well, they all had, melodramas, nobody necessarily sings, but there's some music interpolated, and
Okay, so
they people love music. They
that's
wanted
not an
music.
exact answer. I think what Melay is referring to is the fact that yes, there are certainly musicals,
Hmm.
and and often even from the beginning, but definitely as the years went on, a lot of the plays were sort of pastiche musicals where they pulled together lots of known songs, and maybe then the composer would write some additional material that worked with the story. So musical theater is a big part of it. But what I think Nama was saying when we were talking before this is that music was a big part of all Yiddish theater, even the dramas. And then Nama just brought up the idea of melodramas, which I love. I mean, we all love talking about them. No, maybe some people don't. But the four of us seem to. But I love the thinking the difference between nostalgia
Mm.
and melodrama, because when we think in our 21st century about Yiddish theater, we often think it's nostalgic, and certainly there was a big period, especially post-Holocaust, post-Stalin, after the destruction of European Jewry, the decimation of looking back. Actually, it even starts before that. It's an immigrant thing. You're nostalgic for the land you left behind. You tend to forget how bad it was there and why you left, and
I think the people who were actually there never forgot
no,
how
but
it's their children, I think, and the people who were not there who remembered, who wanted to romanticize the
Mm.
shtetl, but the people who actually came from the shtetl remembered that it was a bit of a nightmare often.
yeah, but I'm also thinking at the same time, well, the most famous Yiddish song I know, Romania, Romania, Aaron Lebedev's big hit, which just talks about how great it was back in Romania. And then it lists all the food that they ate and all the things that they did, so it is definitely a romanticization. Um, but but the idea of nostalgia versus melodrama is not necessarily nostalgic, but it plays on the emotions, and it's not a Yiddish invention in the slightest. There's melodrama in all languages and cultures, but it works in its own particular way in each one. And I'm thinking of the great songs like "A Brivla der Mama," a person singing about getting a letter from the old country from the mother. This this heightened emotions, which you talked to Nama about, crying and crying, and it's almost like it would be considered crass almost in in upper class theater to play on the emotions. But and to go to Melay's question about music, of course the music played into it, and of course you get that classic, not classical, but that Jewish violin which cries out the melody as "Mama, Mama." Oh, it's just it's so over the top that it's beautiful.
Yes, it is. Well, I just want to tell you that it's not that his mother writes to him.
No,
It's that he gets a letter saying your mother is dead, and he's
oh,
been meaning to write and meaning to write for years.
even better, of course, even better. You
Well,
know.
that's
Yeah.
something, in the discussion about nostalgia. Um, what I wonder about is for the people who actually were in New York at the turn of the century on either side, a recurring trope that would be old world versus new world. Somehow a communication to what is left behind, including people, but also even if there's an understanding that you left for a reason, a yearning for what was left.
Sure.
I mean, I think about Town Hall and about the plays that were there in the 70s and 80s. And I know some people might want to call them nostalgic, but I find myself resisting that because I feel like it somehow diminishes their authenticity. And if we think about the World War II, and that ended in 45, and when people finally came to America and nobody talked about that time, and the theater was an opportunity to it was a lightness at Town Hall. Anyway, there were serious plays all around New York, but at Town Hall, with that company Sholem Musical that Raymond Ariel and David Carey produced, that Mary Soriano starred in, it was an opportunity to bring color and life back into a community that had been devastated and darkened. And so I guess I just butt up against nostalgia. And that's all. I just wanted those plays they were pleasing. They were meant to be pleasurable. It wasn't like deep. It wasn't so deep, and the morals were clear, and it was clear what was intended, but it was meant to uplift people, and they did it really beautifully. And the actors who were in these plays, many of whom, like Razel Bujic and her husband, were stuck in Argentina in '39 and did perform there, and Schiffer-Lera was in Argentina, and they came to New York and they stayed, and through Sholem Musical Theater, they did so well. The seasons were 12 weeks long. I mean, those shows, they were able to get groups and buses and group sales, and for 12 weeks, long enough. Part of this was the intention as well, and it was a kindness so that we could collect unemployment. We had enough weeks, we would have enough weeks, thanks to Town Hall, thanks to Ramon and Dave Carey, that everybody would collect. It was a real job. It was a good job in a beautiful theater, and Mary, was a great entertainer, and beautiful and charming, and a voice where she could kind of do a Broadway style tune, as well as a chazonish, we would say, a song that you would hear a cantor sing in a shul on Yom Kippur. I mean, she could sound holy, and there was a great community of actors at that time. There hadn't been for a long time. The war knocked a kind of generation off the stage, and there weren't a lot of people Mary's age. She came between, she was later, like Razel Bujic, Shifra Lera, all born like in 1915, 16, 14. And Mary was from the, 40s. And then the next generation, there weren't a lot of 40s artists. There just were not. I mean, Mary was Romanian and had gone to Israel and stuff like that. But the musical director at that time, René Solomon, who here's the thing for me with Town Hall. I was really young and I knew nothing. And I got to be in a room with these artists who knew everything, whose craft they could draw on from the tips of their fingers. They had their craft. They knew their Yiddish was beautiful. They all had been working since they were children. Razel had been working since she was a child. Shifra, René Solomon was a concert pianist in Paris. She won prizes as a child and had to flee because of the war. And her husband, also a concert pianist, killed in Auschwitz. There was just, it was, so to invoke names, I just have to say, like Karol Latovich and Renee. Look at Renee. She, I just would like to say she was so beautiful, and her hands, no matter how old she was, were just the youngest, softest, strongest looking things, and her little French eyebrows. And she spoke her Yiddish with a French, Eleanor, wusstest du, Eleanor? And Mary, it was a time I was really lucky. I mean, I was lucky to come in at this period of this late 70s, early 80s. And I learned a lot from them. And I just want to say a couple of other names quickly of folks.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
And one was my scene partner often was Sandy Levitt and Harry Pierce and Stuart Figa and Karol Latovich and David Ellen and Leon Liebgold. And there were many of these people who were there with their spouses, their partners. I met my first husband at the Yiddish Theater. That turned out, in some ways good. And so I mean, there was a Felix Fiebig was the choreographer. He put a signature on, oh, goodness gracious, I was young. In case anybody wondered, was I? Yes, I was. And mostly I played the soubrette, the maid. And I mean, I can't, sometimes I would I don't remember which show this was from, but it's in the basement of.
I think it's Rebecca the Rabbi's Daughter.
That one is not. This one is.
Okay.
This wedding is, and there was when we went on tour, Mary wasn't able to go, and like at a last minute thing, I stepped in and I went from the smallest role in the show to the lead, which was the greatest thing. And there's Felix Fiebig in the white as the groom, and the character. It was great playing the lead, I have to say, because every laugh, every dress, every entrance, every tune is I dreamed, I see my mother. That's what I'm seeing. I'm dreaming about my mother, and I see her vision, and it was so fun. And that was, for me, that put me on the map, actually, that when Mary couldn't perform and I played the role for about a month or so, I all of a sudden, it was the beginning of what, I just would love to. So on, if you look at the screen on your right, with his hands in his pockets, that's Felix Fiebig. He was the choreographer.
Hold on, Eleanor?
Yeah.
Just tell me if I'm wrong. He was older than most of the people there. Didn't he choreograph the Dybbuk movie, or am I kidding myself?
I think I don't think so, Frank, but I'm not sure. I'm afraid he's the same age as the rest of them.
Okay, but he had a deep history.
Yes, he did, and he was married to Judith something, please forgive me, who was an even greater, I believe. She took him in a way. The guy standing next to him is Yankele Alperin, who was another Romanian, and that was Mary's co-star. He came from Israel. Next to him is, in the red shirt, is Faye Nicole. All the way is on the left is Shifra Lera, and next to her sitting is Razel Buzik in the back. And the guy squatting was Karol Latovich, who was either married to or dating Ida Kaminska's daughter, and the young redhead was the dance captain. But I just want to say a couple of quick things, and then I will get off this. But so one of the fabulous things about this show, Melay, we rehearsed upstairs in the...
I'm sorry, I'm just interrupting for 1 second. I just did it. He did choreograph the dance sequence in the 1937 classic film.
Wow. Yeah, I didn't know that.
Yeah. Okay.
And I didn't know that.
1937 film. So he was a little older than you think.
Well, I mean, they were all born, I think, in like 1914.
Yeah, exactly.
So in 39, he was 20. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
something like that. He wasn't so old. And but for example, Shifra, the blonde, and the woman behind her, Razel Buzik, they were contemporaries. But in Rebecca the Rabbi's Daughter, Shifra played her daughter, and she was a virgin that they were trying to marry off. And they were trying to marry her to Karol Latovich, the guy who's kind of squatting, and they were so funny you could piss in your pants, and which I think is understood in every language. And part of what was funny about him was he had a stutter, and one leg was shorter than the other, and you can't do that anymore, which is swell, but then, gosh, it was awfully funny.
Well, Eleanor, you've talked about how in some of these productions, in particular the musicals, you throw everything in. Like if you've got someone in there who can sing, then you're throwing some songs in. If you've got someone, for example, with a limp, you see how much of a joke they themselves can make of it. I was wondering if you all could speak about that, like throwing in the kitchen table, almost variety-esque.
But there was a book. I mean, there was a story and there was integrity to the story, but you would feature somebody's strong suit, right? You would do that to please the audience.
Well, also on the topic of what these shows consisted of, we were talking a little bit about themes. So, new country, old country. but then also about class, the sort of upstairs, downstairs version that we're accustomed to, especially in British works. How does that translate, or how does it exist in Yiddish theater and in Yiddish storytelling?
Well, I mean, there's plenty of
know.
conflict in that, right? That's like, where is the conflict between the Puritz, the rich guy who runs the household, and the maid, or his son who wants to be with the maid? And that's where you have your fun and your conflicts. And the same with the old country and the new country.
And what about the prevalence of weddings in these productions?
You got to have one.
Well, the thing about the weddings, and in fact, going back to Felix Freibisch, or Friedrich, however you pronounce it,
Friedrich, yeah,
choreographing the wedding scene in the Dybbuk, and of course the Dybbuk, it's all about a wedding that goes horribly wrong. It's a little bit like Corpse Bride, essentially, but. And it connects with the previous thing you mentioned, Melay, which is having a wedding, a Jewish wedding, a traditional East European Yiddish Jewish wedding, has so many elements to it that it's an excuse for dancing, for choreography, for song, for what we now call klezmer music, which they didn't quite call klezmer music. They would just call it Jewish music. So it was a chance for the orchestra to really shine. And so it gave them a chance to have all these things. And sometimes, not always, so not in every show, there's the badchin, the wedding jester, which is somewhere between stand-up comedy, an MC, and rap all mixed together. So depending on the show, you have all these things that are part of the traditional wedding. When you put a wedding into a show, you have the excuse to use any of these things. And of course, it had to be part of the plot, but that's all the intrigue. So I think that's part of why I originally thought someone had once told me that every Yiddish theater show had a wedding in it. I was corrected, that's not entirely true, but many of them did. And
I mean, you get to laugh, you get to cry. I mean, it's an opportunity to feel all in one scene, really. You're right, Frank. Everything plus the kitchen sink is in there.
I just want to step back for a second and just historically connect the era between the early New York Yiddish theater, starting in the late 1800s and flourishing, through the 20s and 30s. And just in terms of New York history, it's like interesting to know that the first Yiddish theater show, I believe, was in one of the theaters that is now La Mama. So it's really all there. And I need your help, professors. But it keeps on going downtown, at least into the 60s. I have a famous story from my good friend Charlie Steiner, who tells me in the mid-60s, standing on the corner of St. Mark's and 2nd Avenue and pointing down to the Fillmore and saying, "Dad, let's go hear Jimi Hendrix." And his father goes, "No." And he points uptown on 2nd Avenue, goes, "We're going to go to the Yiddish Theater because it's Molly Pecan and Dave Tarras." And Dave Tarras being the greatest American klezmer musician. And again, the musicians were featured, I guess. Is this true? Am I faking it, Nahma? That the musicians were featured in the shows if they had a particularly virtuosic musician. But my point is this. Those both existed at the same time, but relatively shortly after this, and I'm not sure when, Yiddish theater stops happening downtown. And by the time we get to the mid-late 70s and early 80s, it's happening midtown at Town Hall and at various other theaters around, the Broadway theater district. I know Minna Byrne and her husband would be doing shows there.
Well, and you had the Folkspina that was, at first down on Grand Street, right? And then ultimately at Central Synagogue before it was homeless for a while, and now at the museum.
in the by the end of the 60s, early 70s, do you still have Yiddish theater downtown, or is it only being presented uptown? Oh, we lost Nahma's voice. Oh well. When she comes back, she'll be. But in any case, while she's getting her voice back, or so what happens is, this is just to connect it. Eleanor spoke a lot about her first show and the Shalom Yiddish Theater. So this is now, we're in mid-late 70s, and they're presenting Yiddish theater at Town Hall. And like you said, they're doing a season, 12 weeks, 3 months. They're running shows.
Well, I mean, rehearsal was 3 weeks and then 9 weeks, something. But it was
12. I think we.
Yeah.
Show ran like 12 weeks. So it brings it back there, and this is where it lives. And the Shalom Yiddish Theater, and I know we mentioned her, but I want to do you have a picture of Mary Soriano? Because tell me again if I'm making this up or not, but one of the reasons for the Shalom Yiddish Theater was that the producer was Mary Soriano's husband, one of the two producers, and he wanted to feature his wife in these shows. So that's part of what he was doing. So she was the star of all of the shows that
she was the star of all of the shows, but she was the horse to bet on. It wasn't like he helped her. She was it. Without her,
they adored her.
Yeah, sorry, Nahma. Without her.
Yeah, without her, right. Without her, it wasn't the show.
And they sorry.
In Israel, she was already a big star too.
Yeah. So they tried to
theaters.
Yeah. And they tried to like update her. I think one of the last shows, the Oi Mama, Am I in Love, music by a living composer, by Ed Linderman, and the musical director at that time, Barry Levitt, and it was kind of a groovier, an attempt at a groovier situation, modernizing the Showgirl.
We have to talk about the Showgirl in a moment, but I love the fact these are all Yiddish shows, correct? They're in Yiddish, but they took the titles and they gave them English titles, even though it's a Yiddish show. I'm wondering about that phenomenon. So the show you're in, Rebecca, the rabbi's daughter, was Rivka Dem Rebin.
Correct.
Or a Romanische Chasana. But the poster says a Romanian wedding, or Oh Mama, Am I in Love? Oy Mama, Bin ich verliebt.
Yes, or the Jewish Gypsy.
Everyone. So it's kind of funny, like, why, if it's a Yiddish theater show and people, why do they give it English?
Because nobody reads Yiddish. Because their audience that they bust in from Long Island and New Jersey and the groups, they were already assimilated. It was already an assimilated time.
It's a fascinating time. And just to add to the cast, I see you want to say something, Melay, I'm sorry. But it's so funny thinking about this. When we started out, this whole thing got started because Melay and I were talking about celebrating 100 years of Town Hall, looking at history. We're all history buffs. And interestingly, 1982, the Showgirl, Shalom Yiddish Theater at Town Hall, was celebrating. I read this in a review of the show in the New York Times at that date. That was 100 years of Yiddish theater. And now we're at 100 years of Town Hall, 140 years of Yiddish theater. So here we are, we're in Town Hall, which is in Times Square in the 1970s and 80s. If you've seen The Deuce on TV, that only begins to tell what it was like. It was Times Square in all its glory of, prostitution, pornography, burlesque, junkies, transvestite theater, and the famous Times Square art show, which was where Basquiat and I should be able to name of my brain this one. All the greatest artists of the 20th of the latter part of the 20th century. This was Times Square was hopping, and here they are, and they're putting on Yiddish theater shows, but the title's in English because but they're selling out 3 months. There's like almost it's not a contradiction. It's just beautiful. I just it's the gorgeous chaos of what that time was like, and to feel it all, the energy of all of that at that moment. And it's so New York, it's so Times Square, it's so Town Hall, it's so Yiddish, and hopefully when everything opens up and we're able to do live theater and concerts at Town Hall, I hope to present this weird new reinvention of the Showgirl, the show that they did, and it's going to be just. I'll give a clue. Our working title is "Desperately Seeking Nellie," being Nellie Kasman, who wrote the show. The Showgirl is a classic Yiddish theater plot about the son or daughter of a cantor. It can work either way with differences. Who wants to be a performer, but who wants to perform English, pop or jazz. This is the plot of the jazz singer Al Jolson, the first talking movie. This is a classic sort of story. It's got an extra edge when it's a woman because she's forbidden by Jewish law to be singing the music, whereas when it's a man, it's more a classic story of assimilation. And with the woman, you have both. So in our Desperately Seeking Nellie, we throw all these things into the blender, and you have an Orthodox Jewish girl who's the cantor's daughter, who wants to be a performer and comes to New York to audition to be in the Showgirl at Town Hall, and finds that she has no home, and she runs into her childhood best friend, an ex-Orthodox guy who's now a transvestite performer at the Pyramid Club, but all these things, the Pyramid Club, women becoming cantors. You have Deborah Kochko, granddaughter of one of the greatest cantors of all time, who starts the movement of women being cantors in New York in the 70s and 80s. All this is happening, gay and lesbian synagogues, Yiddish, it's all in the blender. And hopefully when we do this show, it's going to celebrate every aspect of this. 100 years of Yiddish, 100 years of Town Hall, Times Square, memorial to victims of AIDS. It's all there, and we'll for sure do it with that extra heightened emotion that'll have people laughing and crying, and because that's what it was. Back to all of you. Sorry, that was my.
No. I'm glad you took it away with the show.
My spiel.
Well, I feel like we've talked a bit about the different elements that end up showing up in the Showgirl throughout, different plays and different parts of history of Yiddish culture, which of course, the usage of a cantor's child, because then there'll be an opportunity for singing. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about that. How religion comes as a plot point, but not necessarily as not as a major vehicle for the plot. But there's a cantor's child. Is that important to have in several of these plays, or is it really just a couple?
I'd like to talk about it, but only from a musical standpoint, and then I hope that Nahma or Eleanor will talk about it from more a socio-cultural standpoint, because I think there's a lot in what you're asking. From a musical standpoint, and one of the people in the chat asked about modern klezmer and Yiddish music, and is it being updated? The musical expression of the East European Jews. Oh, we haven't spoken about this at all yet. There's an old thing, and I wonder if Eleanor can do it. I'm putting you on the spot. There's a way of speaking Yiddish which is a sing-song. It's not just, you're not just saying Yiddish words, ich bin a blah, 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 and that was, but it's got a melody, and our great friend and hero, Minna Byrne, would do it. Can you do a little of that overly with...
I'm not, I mean, Do you know what he means, Nama?
There
Oh,
are regional accents. There
no,
are
no,
Ich bin
a lot of
reinge
accents.
I mean, ich
no,
bin
but
reingekommen und ich hab ihn
yeah.
gesehen und ich hab ihn getan, ich bin dort weggesetzt und gegessen a Borscht.
Now exaggerate that times 20.
Really? Oh, God.
You know what I'm saying? And I've heard and if you listen to the Go Set, which was the Soviet Yiddish theater, and their great performers, Mikhoils and Zuskind, on recordings, it's all, this is where it goes from like Yiddish theater into surrealistic theater because it's so stylized. Not all the time, but this is one of the things. In any case, the expression of the music, both in the instrumental playing of the klezmers, in the singing of the cantors, this stylistic, these ornamentations, this way of doing it is it's one of the things besides the language itself and besides the stories themselves that roots it in the particularities of Jewishness. If we played a little bit of a Yiddish theater song, again, we didn't prepare it, you would know, even if you didn't know that it was the Yiddish language, you would know it's Yiddish, you would know it's Jewish from the sound of the clarinet or the violin, from the and these things, and so that having the cantor in it allows, and this is the religious thing, it allows one to discuss, are we sticking to the old traditions or are we leaving it? That's the kind of religious social aspect, but it also allows them to do things which are deeply old-fashioned, traditional in the music itself. And then other times, and you have to realize this is not a new phenomenon, but even back in the 20s, right, actually earlier in the teens, they were already mixing musically Jewish music, Yiddish music, with American music, with swing and jazz. Nellie Kasman's hit, Yussel Yussel, is sort of somewhere between a Yiddish klezmer-y kind of song and a swing song. And we have By Mir Bist Du Shane in the big hits. So musically, using the cantor allows us to them to say, and here's where it's all coming from in its pure, I hate that word, in its older fashioned form. That's the musical side of it.
I mean, if you think of God of Vengeance, for example, right? And there is a religious element of the brothel owner who tries to buy his way into heaven, but it's not a musical situation, it's a dramatic situation. A good versus evil and hypocrisy, God versus money.
But that's a wonderful. I want to talk about God of Vengeance, but then I want just to say something else about weddings and throwing music. And first, I want to say about God of Vengeance. It's a wonderful example of using religion. It's not about religion exactly, but it uses the way ideally art does. It uses what is deep in the culture. So there's a moment at which the man, the protagonist, realizes that all his scheming is not going to work. This beautiful Torah that he's had written for his daughter in a beautiful white velvet mantle is that may be in her room, but she meanwhile has run off, and he takes the Torah, the scroll, on stage, and he throws it to the ground. Now that is a stage moment. It really is. It's a stage moment if you understand psychologically the man is frustrated and disappointed. But if you are from the culture, which maybe goes to synagogue and maybe then no longer goes to synagogue and maybe keeps kosher, no longer keeps kosher, nevertheless, in that culture, when a Torah gets thrown to the ground, you go, the way the Greeks did. When it's so religion is very useful for art, and in more serious plays, it's not usually. Nobody talks about really, well, not much about whether you believe in God, but it could be like a metaphor. If you there's a play in which the guy refuses to work on Saturday, so it's a religious observance, but what it means to him is he's not giving in to the new ways. It's a metaphor for other kinds of concerns of identity, often identity. But when I made the comparison to the Greeks, I want to say it's the same thing with weddings. It's the same thing. The Greeks always ended their comedies in weddings. It's what makes the human race happy. You get together in pairs and you make babies. It's the it's what makes the world go round. And shows, really good shows, they have enormous energy. And if they have somebody who can sing, great. They find a number for him. Give him a chance to whistle if there was a Yiddish entertainer.
Well, I mean,
but
that's right. There was a Yiddish entertainer who
whistled.
Yeah,
so there were
Pesach Burstein was a whistler.
And then he whistled. And then there was always an opportunity to whistle.
That's right. That's right. And when we had Bruce Adler and Those Were the Days, he did great comic turns, and he did a great Kazatsky. He did that. And so there was a Kazatsky in the show to
but
show
that's not,
how.
But that's not only Yiddish. I mean, theater's popular theater. Popular theater does that.
But, okay,
and audiences love it.
What you just said, Nahma, I just want to go from that, because what is particular and what is universal about it? Oh. And I think most of the things, when we describe them generally, they're universal. One of my favorite books and writers that I think talks about the Jewish experience like perfectly is Maxine Hong Kingston's books, especially Tripmaster Monkey. Now, she's a daughter of Chinese immigrants, and she's writing about her experience. And in Tripmaster Monkey, they're in San Francisco in the 60s creating a new radical Chinese theater troupe based on the old Chinese theater. And I read this book and I love it. And everything about it is exactly the same as everything we're talking about, except for each particular detail. Each particular detail is different, but everything about the contract, the assimilation, dating, intermarriage, the I don't know if we spoke about that already, like the horror of marrying outside the group, the food, the obsession with the foods, using the music, are you old-fashioned? Are you every single thing is identical to our experience, except for the details. And it's the details, which is the intonation, the musical ornamentation. It's a Kazatsky instead of a dragon dance. I don't know if there is a dragon dance. I made that up. But, it's a different dance. But still, it's like the particular dance, the particular food, the particular song, and the particular thing, in-group, out-group, keeping tradition, leaving it. And like you said, Nahma, because there's a wedding, so it's all there. And I think, and when we were talking about African-American theater, when we were talking off camera a little earlier, and about different things, about theaters that are for in-groups and theaters that kind of present the in-group to the greater public, and these two different things. But there's, again, a universality about theater for your in-group, because you can make references, like you said, Nahma, about throwing the Torah on the ground. If let's say you have no idea about Judaism, what's the big deal? They threw this thing on the ground. You might as well break a glass. And the same thing in each group, there are things which rely. It's not about whether you're religious or not. It's about they rely upon a cultural knowledge to inform whether to heighten the comedy or the tragedy or the conflict or the celebration. And in often in these theaters, it's a place where you don't have to explain yourself to everyone else, which
You know, Japan, they did Fiddler. They did Fiddler, and you know, so they open with tradition, and the Japanese, it's their story. It's their story of tradition and modernity and the child who marries out. And they, you know, what did they know that Jews wrote this? I mean, it was a Japanese tale. And you're right, Frank, the specifics are just the specifics, but the general is the story of humankind. That's the point of art, isn't it?
yeah.
But it's interesting, especially, I think, in the US, but likely elsewhere too, that the popular forms of, let's say, like ethnic or in-group, as we've been saying, theater, those themes, those practices, that kind of pleasure-oriented performance also has on the other side, from people in the same group, the avant-garde, the serious, you know, where none of the things that are allowed or even celebrated in, say, like the Yiddish Theater or the Chitlin Circuit or, you know, these other like ethnic theaters, you know, the serious artists in that group wouldn't touch those tropes. Can you speak a bit about that?
And how? There's still, no, there's still a lot of feeling about what is, that the lower Yiddish theater is demeaning and shaming the finer Yiddish theater. Well, you know, Yiddish doesn't have a country. They talk about Yiddish land. It's the language and the culture. There is no country. And if the language isn't kept fine, then what have you got? And there are a lot of people don't suffer quite so much over it as they did. But their feelings still run high, I think.
I was wondering, you know, Eleanor, you brought up a bit of a gap in Yiddish theater history, in the sort of very famous early performers, say, who were born in the 1910s, and then folks who were performing or starting their careers in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I was wondering if we can speak about New York Yiddish theater and Yiddish theater globally after World War II, and also the Yiddish language. In terms of a global Jewish identity and in what is left of a European Jewish identity as well.
I mean, I'm not a historian at all, but I would say that after the war, the desire to assimilate and the desire to put the past, and this is not everyone clearly, but a large majority of people or a large amount of people, to put the past behind them and not teach the children Yiddish and speak Yiddish as the secret language. And it was very damaging to Yiddish. So not only did the Nazis hurt Yiddish, hurt is an understatement, but the desire to assimilate, the desire to be an American, a pure white Goyish American, unidentifiable like everyone else, was important. That you know, people changed their names, people changed their faces so that they could be like everyone else. And then Israel also kind of banned Yiddish. So right now, thankfully, thanks to music and other things, there's a renaissance, and Yiddish is spoken again, and it's appreciated again. But this time, I believe that this period in time was looked down upon. it was looked down upon in the show business industry. For example, I told an agent once that I was doing a Yiddish show at Town Hall in my earlier time there. And they said, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone you do Yiddish theater, because you'll just get typed. And no, don't tell anyone. That's not high art. And it was a struggle, really, that fortunately now people are recognizing from its absence the value of what it was and what it should be and can be.
There's
Nahma?
Well, in Europe, my husband and I taught in Poland for a while. We taught American studies and we taught Jewish studies, American Lit and Jewish studies. So we met people trying to be Jewish, people who have reason to believe or maybe know for sure that they're descended from Jews. And some of them are trying to come back to Jewish history, to Jewish practice. But almost nobody, except for some university departments, almost nobody, Yiddish is not a living language there. And if they're going to study a language, they study Hebrew. I forget the rest of mine.
Back to your question, Melay. So I know that there was a sort of a Yiddish theater was in Buenos Aires, Argentina, in actually both in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and even in a smaller town in Recife, because I've actually visited the Yiddish theater there, and it was a circuit. That's the word I'm talking about. What years is the Yiddish theater happening in Latin America? Is that pre-war or post-war?
Everything, both.
So that continues post-war.
Throughout the 20th century. Yeah.
Oh, we got a picture. Oh, there you go. So for those who don't know, Molly Pecan is maybe the biggest name of female performers in Yiddish theater. And
in the second half, in Yiddish theater, the second half of the century. Not the first.
Oh, so it's the
circus Mädel. The circus Mädel, the circus girl. La Muchacha del Circo.
By Abe Elstein. Oh, it's perfect.
And she was a big star who made it sort of out of Yiddish theater, even into general popular culture.
She crossed over for sure. She was Frank Sinatra's mother in "Come Blow Your Horn."
She in the TV show what's the name, the Jewish sitcom,
The
Goldbergs, which they made a horrible.
That was somebody else.
Gertrude, somebody.
Oh, okay.
Gertrude Goldberg, I think.
So that's her actually on a U.S.
Gertrude Berg.
So beloved, Molly Pecan. So short. I mean, I remember my grandmother, God rest her soul, who was, south of 5 feet tall. And we didn't think of that as being anything special. She was and I don't know about your grandparents, and Molly Pecan was not a large woman, but she dominated the stage.
She was a spitfire. She did everything.
She
played boy roles.
She did boys. She somersault. She did gymnastics. She wrote. She had all Milas, all.
And she went to the camps right after liberation. She went entertaining in the camps.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah.
The last image we showed was of her performing during the war for the USO, but in the States. So, but we got some really good questions from our audience that I'd like to read out to you.
Okay.
From Barbara, we've got, is there an analogy to the high-low with Borscht Belt comedy and high Yiddish literature like Shalom Aleichem?
Oh yeah, we heard it tonight. I mean, it came up. It was mentioned a few times, and not just Shalom Aleichem, who is, well, one of his geniuses is he's popular. He's literature and he's popular also. He's wonderful, but
Sholem Ash.
but
Hirsch Bryant.
Shalamash and Pinsky and people who were so highbrow that they're a stiff nose.
Glotzstein.
Yeah,
We
yeah,
didn't use these words yet.
yeah.
And I think it's important to say Kunst. My wife's German, so I don't speak Yiddish, so I alternately
Kunst,
pronounce Kunst and
Kunst.
Schund. Schund.
Yeah,
These were the
yeah,
words in the language. Kunst, like in German, is art, meaning high art.
yeah,
And Schund does it basically, what does it mean? How would you translate Schund? It's like trash, right?
yeah,
It's like, so
yeah.
this debate and putting things in them,
I asked the dramaturg of the Romanian theater, who is quite a literary man. I mean, he's long dead, but I asked him long ago, how would you define Shun? And he gave me a plot in which there are long lost people and they turn out to be brother and sister and they're in love. But no, but what I want to tell you is that it was the plot of, I recognized it. It was a plot. It was very like a Shakespeare
Yeah.
comedy.
100%. But
So
that's why Shakespeare is so good, because he uses those things and he marries that language of it. But he's telling these stories that
yeah,
that are like these
yeah.
low, not these common popular stories, but with insanely beautiful language.
But the Borscht Belt is an interesting form, right? I mean, it's its own
Yeah.
it's its own form, and part of the thing about the Borscht Belt is who was it for? Who was the audience of the Borscht Belt? And mostly it was Grine, as we say, refugees or non-high class. They were, but they were not perceived as such. They were people in a bungalow colony or in a hotel in the Catskills. They were not your highbrow, right? But those artists were funny, and that was an art form. And it was, I think it's kind of lousy, and I'm sure I do it myself, of choosing one style over another and thinking this is better than that. This is classier or more literate, when in fact, if you're able to touch somebody emotionally to make them laugh or weep, good luck to you. I mean, what's wrong with that?
And I also want to point out, when I know we're kind of going all over the map, but in the 60s and 70s, some avant-garde theaters in New York, and I'm thinking particularly like Richard Foreman's Ontological Hysterical, he dove into Yiddish theater texts, because of something I think you said much earlier, Melay, about being able to go places that you couldn't go in straight theater because they were dangerous, radical, risque, not just controversial in a refined way, but even slapstick. And so Richard Foreman is one of the people who mixed the high and the low and traditional and avant-garde all at once. Oh, don't go on my face alone. I'm done talking about it. But
I want to get to some of these other
questions. Let's get some more questions.
There is another question from Dan. Did Lindy's have any role in the Yiddish theater? Was that a hangout for Yiddish theater actors?
Cheesecake. Was hangout for cheesecake. I don't think so.
I don't think so either.
And then another question from Dan, a geography question. My grandfather had a pharmacy in the southwest corner of 9th Ave and 42nd Street in the early 1900s. Was there any Yiddish theater happening in that area? Or was it all downtown? Or was there some in Midtown?
In the early 1900s. Do you know now?
I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think so.
I don't think so. I'm not going to say categorically there wasn't. but everything I've read, all the posters I've seen, everything I've seen, either it's downtown or even in Brooklyn, but it's
Brooklyn or the
not,
Bronx
or the
or the
Bronx.
Bronx.
Yeah, but not there. But that doesn't mean it wasn't there. But I haven't.
Yeah.
Another very specific question. Did you ever come across my uncles Jaime and Saul Feinstein? The Feinstein brothers were both on the Yiddish stage along with their partners.
I've never heard of them, but whoever that person is, if you have any documentation of them, as you can see, people like us, and there's many people who love ephemera stuff. So if someone
And
in your family, huh?
there's the encyclopedia, 7-volume encyclopedia of Yiddish.
But I'm saying,
I
if
mean, my kid look them up.
you have some family archive heirlooms of anything, you might want to
Yeah.
go to the Evo or something and share
Well,
them.
and I
But
mean,
I want to say, I'm sorry. I want to say, there was a period when I went around lecturing about Yiddish theater and around the country actually, but it's a long time ago. But I was struck how everybody, there was never a lecture after which I lost the clauses, had a relative in Yiddish theater. So everyone, every single group, there is at
I
least one
didn't.
person who had a relative in Yiddish theater. And so so there was a lot of Yiddish theater, and Yiddish theater toured, and maybe there was a show came into town and somebody took a role in it, or maybe there was amateur and there was a professional in it once, or maybe it's just kind of, it was so integrated in the culture. It was so important in the culture. People seem to have loved it so. It's so emblematic of the culture that it feels as if his relatives were in Yiddish theater. He's not lying. It's a way of remembering that they were Jews.
But it's true. But it is also true for every name we mention, there are so many others, and we love mentioning the names. And I think, by the way, Saul and Jaime are two names that aren't being used enough these days. They're ready. They're ready.
They'll come back. They'll come back.
They're ready for a
Yeah.
comeback. Yeah.
I mean, are we going to speak a little about what's happening
That's the
now?
next
Oh,
question.
good.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Lance
Go.
asks, question to the panel. What ways is klezmer being brought into the 21st century? I understand that the language is considered in danger. Is this the same with klezmer theater or music? And I would open that to you all as theater, music, the language, all of it. Where do you see
Okay, I want to
now, and then of course, where would you want it to go? So if each of you could do that. Frank, you go first.
Well, okay. So I have to make one just statement, and then I'll get to where that. A good friend of ours coined the term post-vernacular, Yiddish as a post-vernacular language. Why am I forgetting Jeffrey Chandler's name? Jeffrey Chandler. And the idea of post-vernacular language, Yiddish, Jeffrey Chandler started out by researching dying languages. And there's a famous aphorism that Yiddish has been dying for 1,000 years. It's got a 1,000-year history. Yiddish doesn't fit the definition of a dying language yet. There's too many speakers. There's too much. I mean, we know it in the big scheme of things. It's minuscule beyond minuscule. If there's tens of thousands of people in the world, but maybe barely over 100,000 who actually speak Yiddish. I know that when I worked on Hatway and I was working with people who were Taino, who were trying to revive the Taino, the indigenous Caribbean native peoples language. I mean, you're talking about there's 5 speakers left of the language, and if one dies, there's only 4. I mean, and Yiddish is not a dying language by definition, but most people, it's spoken mostly these days in religious context by Hasidic Jews, And these aren't people who go to secular theater or who play secular klezmer concerts or do this, but there's this insane growth of contemporary Yiddish theater, Yiddish singing, klezmer music. There have probably been more CDs of klezmer and Yiddish music put out in the last 20 years than there were in the last 100 years before that, since the beginning of recorded time. And the reason why is that the culture lives on, but primarily numerically by people who don't speak it. And even going back to the 80s and the 70s, and at what Eleanor was saying about you're at town hall, you're going to see a Yiddish theater show, but they have to put the title in English because people don't read it. And that's already 60 years, 40 years ago, I can do math. So we live in an era, post-vernacular Yiddish, outside of the Hasidic community, and I know I'm overgeneralizing, and we know there are Yiddishist households and there are people who speak it, so I'm not trying to say it doesn't exist at all. But in a big way, it isn't a spoken language among most people. There's no place where it's the native language outside of certain Hasidic communities. But the culture is thriving in ways that, shocking ways. Many of my Yiddish teacher friends say that during the pandemic, their enrollment in Yiddish classes has skyrocketed. People are interested in it before the pandemic. Concerts selling out internationally. We work with groups from all over the world. It's insane, the growth of this. There's a professor, Ruth Wissy, who Ruth Weiss, who sort of has her rap is that kind of Yiddish is a dead language, a dead culture, and it can be studied, but it's not alive. And it's so wrong. It is so alive.
That's not fair.
It
That's
is
not
alive.
fair. That's not what she says.
It
really.
is alive. I've read things where she says this, that it is not a living. She puts down the so-called klezmer revival. She puts down contemporary Yiddish singers because they're not authentic born speakers and they're not from it. But I would argue the thousands of people making contemporary klezmer music, Yiddish culture, and they're doing it in a mixture of languages, and culturally it is thriving, it is alive like it hasn't been in such a long time, except that many and most of the people really don't speak the language. It seems like a contradiction, but it is the fact. It is the real politics. It is the fact on the ground. I am the living embodiment, and I'm not the only one of that, of a person who doesn't speak Yiddish, and yet I wrote a Yiddish opera, and I even had to translate the Yiddish opera into Spanish, which I do speak, to have it performed in Cuba. And there are many, my peers and thousands of us. It is so alive today, and yet people can't have a conversation in Yiddish. I know. So I'm sorry, Nahma.
No, you're on a good jag. I mean, it's an exciting jag, Frank, because it's true. I mean, it feels like there's Yiddish all over the place to me, more than there was in the time when I was at town hall, and I was an exception. I would run into, Zalman Mlotek or Moshe Rosenfeld. There were a couple of core people who were big Yiddishists, and they spoke, and there wasn't that much else. And now I feel, the Yiddish Book Center, you have Krista Whitney, and you have Shane Baker, and you have people who are not Jews who speak beautiful Yiddish and are responsible for moving Yiddish forward. And if you have interest, there's places where you can go and read and look and go online. And I mean, I agree with you, actually, that it's bubbling in a beautiful, beautiful way right now. To me, also.
Yeah.
And that,
I
sorry.
agree with it too. No, of course you're right. Of course you're right. Only Ruth distinguishes. You have her tone of voice wrong. She says she's one of the people that writes the best about Yiddish literature, and she says that it's not what it was, and there's no sense pretending that it is. It's something new. It's something different, and that's true. Isn't it true?
Nothing is what it was. I mean,
Yeah.
nothing is what it was.
There's a Yiddish song like that. Was is gewesen, is
Thank you.
schön.
Can we end with was is gewesen?
Well, I usually don't do this, but there are just 3 more questions that I think are quite good that I want to add in here before we close. One is, are you familiar with Yiddish Theater in London during the Blitz? It went on every night. My friend's father was an actor there, Shloim Cohn. Sorry, Mr. Cohn. Shlomi.
Yeah, there was a lot of Yiddish stuff in London during the Blitz and before and after. There was a whole Yiddish scene, Yiddish culture in London.
Okay,
Not like here, but
yeah.
But I don't know the name. No.
Well, here's another one. As a young kid, I saw Ida Kaminska when she brought Mother Courage to New York City in the mid-1960s. Did she have any influence on Yiddish theater in New York? And I, as someone who doesn't know who this, would also ask, did she come out of Yiddish theater? What was a little bit of her background?
Oh my God!
Ida Kaminska was like the Helen Hayes. I mean, she was sort of the first lady of Yiddish theater in Poland, right, Nahma? The Warsaw.
But her mother was first. Her mother was called the mother of, and then she was
And the daughter, and the daughter played at Town Hall.
Yeah.
Ruth Kaminska was in one of Mary's shows at Town Hall.
And you have, I think,
so she came here. Well, she came here hoping to found a theater here, hoping to be subsidized to have a theater.
That's right.
And I met her in that period, and she was she'd been trooping through the war, trying to get a bottle of milk for her daughter when they were on a train going off. They were in Tashkent. They were always on the run. So she hoped to be subsidized, and she wasn't. So that was the end of that.
You want to, oh, I'm sorry, you're in the midst.
Well, I mean,
I'm not in the midst, but Eleanor's.
But I was just going to say that her style of theater was not what Frank was talking about. Was not the large, hyper.
No,
it was classic theater.
Modern.
Yes, modern.
But she's in a famous movie.
Well,
something little shop on something street.
The house on Main Street. The house on Main Street.
I was close.
It's one of those movies about the Holocaust. That's very well known.
There's another movie that she's in that I have to mention.
What?
It's maybe one of the worst movies of all time that could have been great, but I kind of think everyone should see it as the kind of, and then have a whole discussion about identity and politics. And it's the movie The Angel Levine from 1970, one of the weirdest movies of all time with Zero Mostel and Harry Belafonte. And it's based on a short story. I'm not sure who wrote it.
By Malamed. I never saw it, I think.
And it's about how an old Jewish couple, and the guy is angry with God and life, and he rejects everything. And God sends a black angel, Harry Belafonte, down. And all the angel has to do is get Zero Mostel, the Jewish guy, to believe that he's an angel. And Mostel can't do it. It could have been great. It's kind of terrible in every way. But there's about a 3-minute scene with Mostel and Ida Kaminska where they just speak in pure Yiddish, not subtitled. It is so intimate. It is so beautiful. It is one of the best Yiddish acting, because they're such great actors. They're such delicate actors, and it's some of the best Yiddish acting I've ever seen on the movies. And it's a very conflicted movie, but
But since you're talking about that, I just want to say there are still good Yiddish actors here and in Israel. There are good Yiddish actors.
100%.
There are good Yiddish actors still.
Should we say some names, or will we piss off the people whose names we don't say? I mean,
well, we can, but I think we should mention that Yiddish theater is alive and well in New York, around the country, in Israel, in Europe. It's alive.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. I'm sorry, Melay. You found a poster from Town Hall of a theater of the Polish Warsaw Yiddish Theater that gave a show at Town Hall, which is the Ida Kaminska Theater.
Oh, I hadn't made it.
Yes, that's what it's called. I remember that poster.
But also to say to our audience tonight a few things. This going online, the resources that you can have if you type in either people's names or certain headings. There's so much information out there about the history and the contemporary Yiddish theater. So if we did say a few names, right, I'm going to pitch Yiddish New York, and I'm going to pitch Avi Hoffman and Yiddish Initiative, like people working.
But I'm going to pitch you for a second. And in doing so, pitch the Volksbühne, the National Yiddish Theater Volksbühne, which is, I guess, the longest continuous Yiddish theater in America or in the world?
In the world.
Continuously presenting Yiddish.
More than 100 years.
More than 100 years. And the next show that they're going to have, which should have happened last April, which Alavai will happen next whenever, is a show that Eleanor both translated
with Harvey Varga
and will direct, of The 10th Man.
Patty Chayefsky's play.
The Patty Chayefsky book. So the Volksbühne is doing everything from musicals. They've been in the news a lot lately because of their Yiddish Fiddler, but they're still doing serious Yiddish drama like The 10th Man. And I want to mention, Eleanor already mentioned Shane Baker, who is he was one of the people who translated and acted in the Yiddish Waiting for Godot. And I want to say that there is an event in memory of our dear friend Adrienne Cooper, who was a great Yiddish singer who passed away 10 years ago. She was more than a Yiddish singer. But there's a foundation in her honor, and every year we give the Adrienne Cooper Dreaming in Yiddish Award. And this year it's going to Shane Baker, who, among many things, created the Big Bupkis, a Gentile's Guide to Yiddish Theater, which was his one-man show about Yiddish theater and being a Midwestern Episcopalian who does it. And he's receiving the Adrienne Cooper Award. You can see that online at the end of December as part of Yiddish New York. Go to yiddishnewyork.com. I mean, I'm
the new Yiddish rep. The new Yiddish rep.
The
theaters in Toronto, Montreal.
What's the Montreal theater called?
That's got a long. It's the Dora Wasserman something.
And of course,
I don't remember.
Ida Kaminska, the Shalom Yiddish Theater, not to be confused with the Shalom Productions. Singers Warsaw that played at Town Hall. They're still going strong in Warsaw. There's still
Yiddish Spiel in Israel. I mean, they're and the diversity. It is diverse. Yeah. It is back to all different styles. I mean, Shane does vaudeville type stuff, and with Michael Wex and all sorts of different. Frank and I, we've done things at Carnegie Hall celebrating immigration, and the Yiddish Book Center is a source of enormous and Yivo. Anyway, I mean, it's just know friends.
And then another argument we had behind the scenes, or something philosophical. I contend our other participants disagree, that doing Yiddish theater in English is a form of Yiddish theater. And I want to say that Nahma's work in writing translations and new plays and new librettos based on Yiddish stories, for me, is part of what the living 21st century Yiddish theater. It includes that, even though you're writing in English or you're translating into English, I see that as part of this big picture of 21st century Yiddish theater.
Now, my last word on that.
Well, a translation of French theater in English is not French theater. But certainly what I have mostly done has been part of Yiddish culture. A plain translation is something else. If I translate a Yiddish play, then it's available in English. If it's not, if the play is in English, then it's not Yiddish theater. It's a Yiddish play, maybe, but what you're going to that night, what you bought a ticket for, is not Yiddish theater.
Let me say for them.
What do you think, Eleanor?
I mean, we disagree.
But it's part of the ways of maybe, okay, how's this? It does bring people into it's a gateway drug.
Sure.
But Eleanor, what do you say? What were you saying?
Well, I mean, I was just thinking, indeed, Melay, how shall we close? You know, what shall we say about Yiddish theater and Yiddish theater at Town Hall, and it's rich. It's so rich in history and in artist development. The shows would progress and grow, and the audiences would grow. And I was a brunette. I mean, I had brown hair in those days. So anyway, I think I said that. Oh gosh. Yeah, but somebody like
grades.
It's a
grades you had.
It's a great opportunity. That you've given us.
Yeah, thank you.
That you've given the theater.
Move forward with it.
Yeah.
We want to be part of the development as well, because it's such an important part of our history. And we have a good question, which I think is a very good question to end on. Suggestion for books on the history of Yiddish theater. I would think Vagabond Stars would be a good place
Absolutely.
to start. So if you look up Nahma Sandrow, Vagabond Stars, that could be a good place. Nahma, is there anything?
There are so many now. When I wrote that was, people said to me, that's no subject. What is there? There's nothing there. Right? A little bit of shund. What else is there? But now there are people all over the place, and not just in America and in other countries. There are conferences and people doing dissertations. There's a lot written about it now. Just look it up. Just Google it. Lots to read.
Well, I do want to thank you all so much. This is so fun. It's been so fun speaking to you before and during this. Really, thank you so much for spending this special night. And it's Hanukkah.
It is Hanukkah. Happy Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah, everybody. Yeah, Frank is over there cooking, not sharing it with us, but making food in the lab.
I'd love to if I could. Yeah. I decided to make my own applesauce for my latkes tonight.
You know, I remember when we played Town Hall sometimes over Hanukkah, there were latkes. Is there a kitchen? Was there a kitchen at Town Hall?
Well, we do our craft services downstairs, but there's a little kitchen there's a kitchen upstairs.
Yeah,
Are you talking about now or 40 years ago?
40 years ago.
There was a place to make food. Yeah,
40. Like we would light my memory is that we would light the candles, and I just want to shout out to the backstage crew at Town Hall, Billy and his dad Kirk. Maybe I'm mixing up the names, but
you got it right. Thank you so much. Well, Everybody, thank you so much for spending this evening with us. This is the last of our century of story and songs this year, and we're ending it with a bang. So thank you so much, our guests, for joining us. To support the Town Hall and programs like this, please visit thetownhall.org/donate. Thank you to everyone at the Town Hall, especially the production team who made this possible. That is Jeff and Alex. Thank you to the entire Town Hall staff and the board. Please subscribe to our newsletter to keep up with our events, including 2 new events we have listed, 2 upcoming programs. Maritza, performing the works of Amalia Rodriguez on January 29th, and Judy Collins, a celebration of her 1964 Town Hall debut and album. Please go ahead and buy your tickets. That show is on February 12th. Have a great holiday. We will see you in the new year. Sign up, and we'll see you in a few weeks. Happy New Year.
Vergiss mich nicht. There where you go, my heart goes away with you. Your name and mine are bound together. Yes, 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 it's true. 3 little words, they mean such a lot. There where you go. There where you go, please take me wherever you go. Forget me not. Oh no, vergiss mich nicht. Oh!